Every spiritual tradition has a word. For the moment, the self stops being something to perfect and starts being something to see through. You did not come to this question from calm. Something stopped working first, and when you looked for what was wrong, you found the ego, not a wound to heal, a lens to examine. The Sufi poet Rumi wrote about the nafs, the lower self, not as an enemy to destroy, but as a student to educate. In classical Sufi psychology, there are 7 stations of the nafs, from commanding to pure, each representing a stage in the refinement of the self rather than its removal. The ego does not disappear on the path, it graduates. What makes this tradition distinct from purely non-dual frameworks is the insistence that the self has work to do before it dissolves. You cannot skip the stations. The nafs must be transformed through service, grief, and sustained attention before the final station of surrender becomes available. Today, most Western spiritual seekers jump straight to the dissolution language without passing through the refinement stages the tradition requires. They speak the vocabulary of the final station while still operating from the first end. The language of ego dissolution has always been easier to afford when your material needs are met. The desert fathers left their cities for the Egyptian wilderness in the 3rd century. Siddhartha left a palace. John of the Cross wrote from a prison cell, which he did not choose. The ones who chose voluntary poverty had enough security to choose. The ones who had nothing rarely appear in the canonical texts. This pattern continues. A week-long silent retreat costs more than many people earn in a month. The books are in English. The teachers are mostly in cities where rent is high. The path is real. The map of it has been drawn by people with time and money to spend finding the way. That gap does not make the destination false, but it does mean that for millions of people, the ego that needs transforming never gets the conditions the tradition assumes. The ego's most dangerous move is adopting enlightenment as its newest achievement. You can recognize this pattern by what it produces. Someone who has genuinely softened the ego becomes quieter, less certain, harder to provoke, and less interested in being recognized as awakened. Someone whose ego has dressed itself in awakening language becomes louder about their humility, more aggressive in correcting others, and deeply invested in being seen as someone who has arrived. The teacher who needs students in order to feel like a teacher. The practitioner who cannot be questioned without taking offense. These are not failures of will. They are the ego running its standard operating procedure through new software. The inversion is total, because the language of selflessness becomes the vehicle for self-promotion. And the people most at risk are the ones who have done enough practice to believe they are past the risk. The moment does not announce itself. A person is washing a dish and becomes aware of the water temperature in a way that has no agenda. No one is watching, nothing is being practiced, the ego is present, the awareness of the ego is also present too. And for a few seconds neither one is trying to win. That is the texture of what these teachings point toward. Not a vision, not a state to maintain. A brief lowering of the guard that the self usually holds against the present moment. What is striking about the accounts people share is how ordinary the trigger is. A bus window, a dog sleeping, the sound of rain on a roof. The ego recognizes none of these as significant, and so for a moment stops performing. The presence that remains in that pause is not a different self. It is the same self without the performance. Here is the bind the ego cannot solve from inside itself. The ego is the thing doing the work of transforming the ego. Every technique, every practice, every moment of self-observation is organized and executed by the very structure being examined. This is not a problem to fix. Every tradition that has sat with this long enough arrives at the same conclusion. The work is not to escape the bind, but to hold it consciously. Rumi held it through longing. The Sufi masters held it through service. The desert monks held it through repetition and silence. What they shared was a willingness to stay inside the contradiction without collapsing it into a resolution. The ego that cannot transcend itself is not broken. The tension that produces is not a symptom of failure. The capacity to stay in that tension without reaching for relief is what every tradition across every century has actually been trying to cultivate. If the ego is the thing doing the work of dissolving the ego, what exactly is left when the work is done?